Hi everyone, my name is Josh Lanham, and I'm really looking forward to getting to know everyone that I don't already know from last semester through these video conversations. I'm looking forward to some great conversation about different educational topics and just a lot of good back and forth. Some background about me, let's see, for the last 8 years, I've been working in the pharmacy benefit management field. I've been working at Express Scripts in their sales and account management departments, just doing different project management roles. And after 8 years there, decided it was finally time for a career change. It was never kind of the work I was wanting to get into, but you finish college, you need a job to start paying back the student loans. So, I took a job and told myself I'd be there a year and then figure out what I really wanted to be when I grew up. And 8 years later, I'm still there, but I finally figured it out and taken those next steps to get there. And looking forward to all the courses and learning all this new information and ultimately becoming a high school English teacher. So that will be my area, be high school English. And it's been kind of a long journey to get there. 8 years at a job, couple degrees. My undergrad was in Christian ministry, which I got from Lindenwood. Then a few years after that, I went back and got my master's in writing from Lindenwood, and now I'm back at Lindenwood again for my master's in education. And so far, it's been great. So let's just kind of dive into these questions. So question 1, what types of written texts are commonly used within your content area? So like I said, I'll be doing high school English. So I would say your classic examples of text in there are just your classic literature anthology textbook and your classic novels that you often see in high school English classes, such as The Great Gatsby, Scarlet Letter, To Kill a Mockingbird. All the classics you're always hearing about. I would say those are probably your primary texts. I know there's a lot of different things that you can do within English, and lots of different ways to engage your students with different things to read, short stories, poetry, nonfiction, fiction. I mean, there's just so much. But I would say your textbooks and classic novels are generally the ones you're going to see the most in the English classroom. Question 2, are students specifically taught how to read these texts? If so, how? I would say yes and no. In high school, by the time the students get to you, they've already been taught to read. You expect them to be able to read. So you're not really taking the time to specifically teach students how to read, particularly when it comes to a lit textbook or a novel, because you're expecting students to be able to read at that point. There may be different things that depending on how creative you want to get, that maybe students haven't seen a lot of, that you have to explain a little bit and kind of teach them the form and how it's structured and how to read it. But for the most part, I would say there's not a lot of teaching how to read at the high school level. Question 3, what other forms of text are found within your discipline? So like I said before, there's a lot that could go in here, and I think it depends on how creative the teacher wants to be. You've got your traditional literature textbook, you've got your classic novels, but there's so much more. I think something fun to dive into is graphic novels. It might seem silly to use a graphic novel as opposed to some classic work of literature by some world famous author, but I think students can learn just as much about character development and storytelling and plot structure from a graphic novel, and it's something that is probably more engaging and more fun for a student than some of those classic works. It's something different, and apart from just the literature of it, the written word, you've got a lot of visuals and a lot of great artwork, and that can be just as impactful on a student, just as influencing, and they can take a lot from it, and in a different way. Another thing would be like movies or TV shows, something that's not necessarily written word like we think of a lot when we think of an English class. But one thing that struck me as we were reading some of the different articles that we were assigned this week was just this idea that we need to get kind of beyond this thought process of just the written word when we think of text, And for me, I'm a huge movie and TV guy. Spent probably way too much time watching them, but there's so much good stuff in there that students can take from that and learn and apply it to the things that they're writing, particularly when it comes to writing stories, works of fiction. One thing that, which one was it? I think it was the reading in the disciplines, when they were talking about adolescent literacy. I think it was one of the first readings we had for this week. In the kind of literature class section, they were talking about Star Wars. And I mean, for me, I'm a big Star Wars guy, so any chance to talk about Star Wars or watch Star Wars, I will take. But the original Star Wars movie is such a great example of the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And part of that is just because, when George Lucas was making this movie back in the 70s, I mean, he worked with Campbell to build that into the storytelling. And so the story of Luke Skywalker is just such a great example of that. And it's so much easier sometimes for students to kind of get lost in a film and just really absorb kind of that material and understand the journey the character's going on more so than they might from an older work of literature where, it's a little more dated and the times just aren't as relevant as they are to what things are happening in kids' lives today. I think the text even talked about this. It's easier for students just to suspend their disbelief when they're watching a movie. So those can be great tools, especially if you can take a modern TV show and relate an episode to, what's happening in that episode to what's happening in the text you're reading, and just, find those parallels and relate them to your students. It will just help them better understand some of these older works that in a way that they may not have before. Trying to think, music, art, different news articles. Music is huge. I mean, not only is there written words in the lyrics, but there's just something about music that we can connect to on a whole different level. And for me, as a writer, sometimes when I'm listening to a song, I can just close my eyes and picture a scene. For me, when I write, stories, it's almost like I write it as if it could be a movie one day. And so I close my eyes and picture how that scene might play out with a soundtrack in the background, and that's just how I create. One of the ways, I should say. And there's just a powerful connection that people have to music, and music and poetry is just a great way to engage students because there's such a broad variety of music and poetry and art that you can connect to students with so many different interests. And I think that's kind of key, connecting with students on a different level than maybe they're used to in a more traditional classroom setting. So moving right along, number 4, are students specifically taught how to read or engage with these forms of text? I think it goes back kind of the same for the second question with the common text. No, not really, just because at the high school level, you're kind of expecting them to be able to read already. There may be a few examples, like maybe, with a graphic novel, maybe some students aren't really familiar with kind of the structure, and sometimes, they can jump around the page a little bit. So maybe you have to help explain that a little bit. But I think in general, there's not a lot of explaining that you have to do because students are familiar with, a traditional novel. They're familiar with a news article. I hope. I mean, a lot of students today may not really pay attention to the news. So, but movies and TV shows, I mean, that's basic. In general, I'd say no. I'd say that at that point, you're kind of expecting them to be able to read and comprehend on a basic level. But there are always going to be students who may have a little more difficulty than others, and you may have to give a little extra time to them. And we'll talk kind of more about that in one of the other questions, which I believe is the next one. So number 5, what are some challenges that students might experience as they learn to read these types of texts, and how can you help students work through those challenges? So I think there's really 2 key challenges. There's a lot more that could come up depending on the student, but I think there's kind of 2 overall challenges that may come up. The first one is that you're going to have students at different reading levels, especially at the high school level. So that's something you need to be cognizant of as you're kind of assigning different texts and working with your students. Something to do to help is number one, just pay attention. Get to know your students, get to know about their lives and their interests, and just pay attention. Are they participating in classroom discussions? Does it seem like they're grasping what concepts are in the material that they're supposed to be reading? And if not, that may be a sign of something else. Maybe they're, the novel that you're reading is a little higher reading level than that they're accustomed to. And then you just have to find different ways to engage. Like I said, I think English lit classes have been done the same way pretty much forever. I mean, the same textbooks have been used forever. And I think to engage students today, we gotta get creative and do things differently. Maybe it's using a graphic novel or using a movie to tie in with whatever you're reading. And I think those kind of things are going to help engage those students who are maybe at a slightly lower reading level or having a little harder time comprehending the material. It's a different way that they're going to be able to relate and grasp the concepts and understand. And that's what we really, our goal is. We really just want to find ways to help the students understand and, get everything out of the class that they can. The other kind of challenge or that we may experience is simply specifically in high school English classes is just level of interest. Some kids are not going to have any interest in reading, a classic novel. I've always loved to read, and, I read as much as I can, but even back in high school, a lot of times I didn't really want to read some of those classic texts. Gatsby, Mockingbird, all these. I certainly have a greater appreciation for them now that I'm older and can go back and read them and really appreciate just the stories and the different facets of what goes into writing those. But I mean, even as a high school student that loved to read, it was sometimes just draining. I didn't care, so it was hard to really pay attention and try and participate. So I think that one thing we should look for, in our classes is kind of like I said, different forms. But even when it comes to just reading a novel, assigning novels, think of something more recent, some more contemporary works. Just because something's labeled a classic doesn't mean that it's the only way to learn a certain aspect of literature. There's so many great recent books that we can use that can showcase character development, plot, and just all the different facets of literature. Creating conflict and just all that. I mean, writing stories is so intricate, and there's so many facets of it that that's a whole another video. But the key is just not to stick to the status quo. I think that's the biggest thing. We got to be flexible and willing to adapt and figure out what's going to work best for the students in our class. And that's going to change. It could change day to day, and it's certainly going to change year to year with the different students that we see. Not every student is the same, and not every class will be the same. So we just have to be willing to adapt and meet our kids where they are. And, by getting to know them on a personal level, their family lives, their interests, we're going to be able to do that more effectively. I think I've rambled on way too long. I could keep talking, for hours on this stuff. And I think that's how I know that I'm on the right path as far as, a new career. But I'll leave it at that. Feel free to leave, comments, on anything I've said, and I'll be happy to respond. Hopefully this video turned out well. I'm really not accustomed to videotaping myself. So hopefully, my eyeline's good and I'm not constantly all over the place and looking, in a direction I shouldn't be. But, I think for the first go around, it probably turned out okay. Like I said, looking forward to getting to know you all this semester, and please just leave any comments you have. Thanks.